Good morning, everybody. My name is Ryan Steens. I'm the Avalon Community Manager, and welcome to Samvera Virtual Connect 2019. We've got a very packed program over the next 2 days, so I am going to jump right into it. We can get to the next slide there. I guess we're not going to jump right into it. Let's see here. The program is available. Rebecca has just posted it to the chat. Please take a look there. And do know that you are being recorded, even though you are being muted. If you do need to ask us a question or alert us to issues, we have a Slack channel open and hope to show that shortly. It is pound virtual-connect-2019. And of course, you can use the Zoom chat. We'll be collecting those questions into a document, and I will be reading those questions up to the speakers and the questions we are unable to answer in the question time. We will then save and share with those speakers to get back to you later. In addition, there's community notes. The community notes are something we're hoping we have something like 170 people registered. Please participate in making sure this is a well-documented event. That's kind of a Samvera tradition. We also have a code of conduct and an anti-harassment policy. I'm not going to spend time going over those now, but we do take them very seriously. So as good Samverans, please familiarize yourself with those, and let's all help each other out and be kind. The schedule is going to be very tight, as I said. We're running about 3.5 hours per day. We're going to have a break in about 2 hours from now. Questions will not be addressed as we go along. Instead, we're going to save them for the blocks of time reserved at the end of each section. And please enter questions into Slack and Zoom chat. If your mic is currently open, please make sure you mute yourself and make sure your camera is off. We are trying to keep the bandwidth free and open. For the full program and for links to the community notes, go ahead and click on that link that we have there, or I'm sorry, I guess type that in, and easy enough to find. I do want to thank the crew that worked on this. Everybody on this team worked super hard, including Brian McBride, who is now in Paris on vacation, and we're all very jealous. Chrissy has been amazing as my co-chair, and I did maybe 20% of what she did. Then we've got John, who is currently running the Zoom operation out of Indiana. Todd is going to be our timekeeper today out of Houston. And Rebecca is keeping an eye, I believe, on the Zoom chat. And Kate, I believe, is keeping an eye on Slack. So we are trying to be very mindful, and this team very much appreciates your participation. Very excited to announce I think we all knew we were going to St. Louis for Samvera Connect in 2019 in October. There's lots to do there. They've sent us kind of a little bit, some images to take a look at to see beautiful St. Louis. In addition, on the next slide here, there's a little bit of information about the call for papers, panels, posters, whatever, is coming out Thursday. So already this week. So you guys can start thinking about what you might want to do in St. Louis. And we will see you all there, hopefully. with that, let's get started. I believe the first thing we're doing are some community updates. Samvera Steering Group with Richard, Roadmap Council with Jen, Fundraising Working Group with Karen, and the Marketing Working Group with Chris. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and hand things over to Richard.
Thanks, Ryan. Hello, I'm Richard Green, currently chair of the Samvera Steering Group, and I'm here today to update you on some of the things that Steering has been doing over the last few months. I must start by giving you John Dunn's apologies. He is chair-elect and will take over from me in the summer. We were to do a joint presentation, but John is unavoidably busy elsewhere. Steering's role is essentially stewardship and central administration of the Samvera community. And for the purposes of today's presentation, we can break that down into three parts. Carrying out the administrative tasks that come from initiatives agreed by partners, annually repeating tasks, and finally, occasional tasks that come up. I'll deal with each of those in turn and highlight just some key events. Around this time last year, the Samvera partners voted to adopt the set of recommendations put forward by the Governance Working Group that they had commissioned. These recommendations are changing the makeup of the steering group and the way that its members come and go. The changes had implications for the legal documents underpinning the Samvera community, and it has taken some time to get the new versions approved by legal counsel and to make the new materials available. That work is only just now complete. The Governance Working Group also recommended the formation of a Roadmap Council. Last fall, Steering put in place the partner vote to ratify its charter and, at the same time, to approve a new set of bylaws for the steering group. Both were approved unanimously. A major initiative proposed by the Governance Working Group was that, as a community, we should work towards being able to appoint 2 full-time staff, termed, for the moment at least, a community manager and a technical manager. This will require that Samvera has a much greater annual income than at present. 2 working groups are addressing means of achieving this. The Fundraising Working Group, who will be presenting shortly, and the Contribution Model Working Group. In conjunction with these groups, members of Steering have also been exploring the possibility of short-term seed funding to help accelerate the hiring of at least 1 staff position. Each year there is a list of annual jobs that the Steering Group take on for the community. And since our very successful Connect conference last fall, there have perhaps been 2 of these worthy of mention. Each year, members of Steering's Finance Subcommittee negotiate a memorandum of understanding with our fiscal sponsor, Eurospace, that sets out the terms of our relationship with them for the coming 12 months and agrees the charges that we will incur for the service. This year was no exception, and we agreed a memorandum for 2019 on exactly the same terms as for 2018. Many of you will be aware that Eurospace has recently announced that it is merging with Lyrasis. We have been reassured that there will be no adverse impact on the relationship that we currently enjoy with them. The other annual task I should like to mention is the production of Samvera's 3rd annual report. The report serves both to document our community's progress and, perhaps more importantly, as something that you can use to share information about the Samvera community with colleagues. Senior colleagues in particular may find it a useful summary that justifies their organization's involvement with us. The 2018 report can be downloaded both from the wiki and from the website. Please share it. Finally, I come to some of those occasional tasks I mentioned. 2 tasks are always a pleasure. Welcoming new people to the community by receiving and accepting contributor licensing agreements from them, and admitting new partner organizations. Over the last few months, there has been a steady trickle of CLAs, and we now have more than 300 individual CLAs and almost 80 corporate CLAs on file. Even accepting that some of these people and organizations have now become inactive, the numbers are quite impressive. We have recently signed up 2 new partners, the University of Utah, who hosted last year's Connect conference, and Ubiquity Press. Ubiquity is a vendor which is currently developing a haiku repository service to include research outputs from the British Library, the British Museum, the Tate Galleries, National Museum Scotland, and the Museum of London Archaeology. Steering, in its role as a steward of the community, has been having its own discussions about helping to secure Samvera's future. Members of the group have come up with and pursued a number of initiatives of their own, 3 of which are perhaps worthy of mention here. First, we have had discussions with the Roadmap Council to put in place a turnkey Docker script for Hyrax, alongside the existing Docker script for Haiku, with improved documentation for new developers wanting to try out these applications. Second, we shall shortly be launching Samvera's own repository instance. This is effectively a marketing tool to showcase a vanilla version, to showcase what a vanilla version of our software looks like. Of course, with the message that it can be enhanced to be much, much more. The contents will be the many presentations and posters from past Connect conferences. The marketing group will talk about some more initiatives shortly. Lastly, Steering felt it was important, as we are in a year of change, to go through a visioning exercise to help set the tone of Samvera's future path. You've likely received emails from Hannah Frost about that. Members of the steering group take on their role in addition to the other things that they do for the community. For instance, its members are active in any number of key working and interest groups. As the outgoing chair, I should like to thank each and every one of them for their support and encouragement, but beyond that, for their outstanding contributions to the community as a whole. Thank you all.
Thank you, Richard. If you do have questions, do drop them into Slack or the chat. And moving on, I believe we have Jen is up next.
Yes. So I'm Jen Young, and I'm here to give you a brief update on the work the Samvera Roadmap Council has been doing. So our membership is made up of the product owners of Avalon, Hyrax, and Haiku, working group, the core components maintenance working group, the metadata interest group, repository management interest group, and lastly, a representative from service providers. Yes. So our scope, we were chartered per the governance recommendations that were adopted by Samvera partners in April 2018. So our original scope is that we want to identify any cross-project development and maintenance sprints that might be needed to advance the work of the Samvera community. Next slide, please. So right now we are meeting actually every other Tuesday at 11 Central Daylight Savings Time. And the work that we have done since we started meeting in October of 2018 is the first thing we did was develop a template for the Samvera wiki for the groups because we found it was very difficult to find certain information. So we have an example right now on our wiki page. Excuse me. And then the big thing that we've worked on was the white paper that I hope all of you saw, the state of Samvera technology in 2019, where we discussed the state of Samvera technology, but also identified challenges to continuing the development of that work. So next, we're working on the scope of, excuse me, we want to identify community feature requests and roadmap planning, and how do we pull that all together, and also looking at resourcing and how do we get the resources to do that work, as well as communicating all of this information back out to you. So we have a Slack channel, and we also have our wiki page. And we are very open to any feedback or questions that you might have about any work that we're doing or you would like us to do.
Thanks so much, Jen. I believe next up is Karen.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me. I'm going to report on the Samvera Fundraising Working Group. Our chair is John Dunn. Our regular meeting time of sorts is at about 11 o'clock on Tuesdays every 2 weeks. Sometimes that shifts around a bit. We have a Slack channel that's posted there. So our activity since the last Connect is that we are a three-prong approach to looking for funds. We're seeking support from partner institutions via the annual requests that you see through emails and various other outreach activities for financial support. We are exploring possible grant funding from third party, from foundations, agencies, and philanthropists. We are developing a way to, and hoping to secure external sponsorship for Samvera Connect this year as a kind of a test run pilot case. Samvera Connect is the face-to-face meeting of this meeting, basically. Next slide. So we have developed some fundraising. What we've actually done so far is develop some fundraising text for the Samvera annual joint appeal with Duraspace. Note goes out with Duraspace for their annual financial request. We also have some for just Samvera messaging. We have been discussing the contribution model phase 2 working group intersection because obviously as we are looking to fundraise from our partners, that is also part of the contribution model working group. So we've been talking to them about how we cross paths. We've been exploring how we might approach philanthropic funders like foundations and grants if there are any opportunities there. Again, that also is complementary to the contribution working group recommendations. And finally, we are writing a report on Samvera Connect sponsorship. We're thinking about the pros and cons, what the expectations from the sponsors might be, what the expectations from our members might be, and how we might then use those funds that we raise through that activity. So that's the end of the report. Please give generously and give often. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Next up, we have Chris talking about the marketing working group.
Thank you, Ryan. So yes, I'd like to give an update of the work of the Samvera marketing working group over the last few months. As the slide says, we meet regularly at 11:30 Eastern time on Wednesdays every 2 weeks. And we again also have our own Slack channel for anyone who'd like to just throw us questions or get involved in the conversations as we go along. We started last year with the aim of pulling together some standard information about Samvera that could be used in a consistent way by anyone looking to promote or talk about Samvera, either within their own institution or at events they were attending. And to that end, we have produced some initial materials, which over the last few months we've sought to try and develop and refine so that they mature into a set of pieces of information and that can be used by anyone in whatever situation they find themselves in talking about Samvera. So we have a revised and improved leaflet, which can be downloaded for local printing and use whenever you need it. And I'll put the link to that in the Slack channel. It's actually on our working group wiki page if you want to go straight through there and download it yourself. We also have been looking to try and pull together some stickers, or make sure we still have a stock of those stickers, the hex stickers that you may have seen at Connect or other events, so that they can be used on an ongoing basis. And that's the Samvera hex sticker, but we're also looking to put together a stock of stickers for other initiatives related within Samvera, for example, Hyrax and Haiku. We've been taking the FAQ we developed last year and turning it into expanding it, and we've got some additional questions we're looking to get up and running very shortly. We've been reviewing the introduction to Samvera slides that we use at conferences for workshops so that they can be used by anyone who wishes to do an introduction to Samvera at other events. And we're also taking on board some of the feedback from partners last year about trying to personalize Samvera a bit more by developing some personal profiles of people involved in the Samvera community, and also developing some case studies of how Samvera has been used for various different purposes. And all of those are all in progress, but we hope to get them available on the website soon. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we started off by taking that, generating this stable information that can be used by others in the promotion of Samvera. What we're looking to do next is to develop what we have for specific audiences. So we've been looking to reach out to a generic audience for now. But we'd like to refine it and focus some of that information so that it's targeted at senior managers in some cases, tech staff in some cases, library colleagues in others, making it more specific to their needs and understanding of what Samvera can do for them. We're looking to expand awareness of Samvera at events. We have this year so far going to have a presence at the Digital Initiative Symposium in San Diego shortly, at Open Repositories in Hamburg in Germany in June, and we are also going to be at DLF. If you are attending events later this year where you could have an opportunity to talk about Samvera, please do let us know, and we'll look to work with you as we can to help support you in doing so. We're also going to take at next week's partners meeting, there is a visioning exercise taking place, and the marketing group is very keen and interested to see what comes out of that exercise and how we can take and develop marketing messages from that to help spread the message of what Samvera can do for people. Our next call is on Wednesday, May 8th, so if you'd like to, please do join us, especially if you have ideas for how Samvera should be best communicated, and to let us know what would work best for you in talking about Samvera wherever you happen to work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. I don't have any questions dropped in, so unless there are any questions incoming, I am, what? No, okay. I'm going to pass the mic over to Julie, Randall, and Ned.
Oh, hi, this is Julie. I'm just sharing my screen. Okay. I'm going to be presenting with Randall Floyd from Indiana and Ned Henry, although I think he may have been held up. So if he's not around when we get to his slides, I'll quickly cover his work. Randall, Ned, and I are all members of a working group at the moment called M3, or Machine Readable Metadata. And we're going to talk a little bit about the sort of challenges of doing complex metadata stuff with hierarchs and some of the solutions we've come up with. And then Randall will draw that to a close. So, I mean, as everyone will know, if you're trying to do more than basic metadata in hierarchs, you've got a bit of work to do, or anyone who's done work in this area will know. And people do different things. So people have different types of objects, and they describe them in different ways. So I might choose to have a creator, someone else might choose an author, we might use different predicates, we might use different terms for subjects or keywords, we might have different date terms. And in one sense, that's fine, but it reduces our ability to interoperate. And it also means there's a hell of a lot of duplicated effort going on across the community for things that are broadly similar and use cases that are broadly similar. Another problem, well, it's not a problem, but in hierarchs, it's quite a bit of work to actually add new properties into a model in hierarchs. So it's easy to generate a new work type. Sorry. I'll put it on the screen on this slide. Apologies about my mouse there. Yeah, so extending models in hierarchs it's easy to generate a new one, but then extending the basic metadata set is quite a bit of work. So you have to add new properties to the model files, and there's different ways to do that depending on the type of property you're creating. You have to add to the form. You can customize that in different ways. You have to add specific fragments of HTML if you want the form to behave in a different way. You need to edit the presenter class. You need to edit the Solar document. You need to edit the attributes HTML fragment page. There's also the help text and labels that have to be overridden and added to if you want anything bar the basic defaults. So it's quite a complex problem. And then at the end, you have to edit the catalog controller, which is quite a complex file for anyone who's ever looked at that. And that's to allow it to be searched in the hierarchy search. So hierarchy provides lots of great functionality, but when it comes to metadata, you've got basic metadata. And then beyond that, you're kind of on your own at the moment, albeit with some good documentation. And as anyone who's a metadata librarian or has been involved in metadata modeling, it's quite hard. It's quite time consuming to do it well and to do it sort of properly and to pick out the right predicates and to assess the sort of domains and ranges and all that kind of thing. It's quite a skilled task. So there are 3 community approaches at the moment that people have taken to try and address this problem. So I'm going to talk about the one that I created, which is called Dog Biscuits. This came out of work I started in my old job at the University of York, and I've since made it a community gem. So the idea behind Dog Biscuits is it provides a set of reusable models, properties and behaviors for common work types. And then it provides generators, which is for those who aren't developers, generators are a kind of way of injecting functionality into a hierarchy application by running a command. And then it provides configuration options so that those models and properties can be tailored to local needs. So it's not just one thing out of the box. It does have a level of configurability. So just to run through that in a diagram form. So the idea there is you choose a model. So there's a pre-created set of models available through Dog Biscuits that I do occasionally add to. And it's based on common use cases, so journal article, published work, that kind of thing. And then you create a configuration file that in your local hierarchy application, and that defines things like, of the 50 available properties on journal article, I want these 10, and I want them in this order, and I want these 4 to be required fields, and I want some different labels, and I want some help text, and that kind of thing. So there's quite a lot you can configure using the Dog Biscuits configuration file. And then at the end, you run the generate script, and you get your tailored model in your hierarchy application. And then just to show a little bit of the configuration file, hopefully this is clear. So just on the top left-hand side, you can configure facet properties, so you can define which fields you want to appear in your facets in the search. At the bottom corner there, the restricted properties is something I added quite newly, and that enables you to define some fields that can only be edited or visible in the form to a particular group or role. So but the default is admin. So that was a use case that came up for us, and I added that into Dog Biscuits, and that can be sort of enabled or disabled. And then on the right, that's just a fairly straightforward list of the properties and the order in which we want them to appear for a journal article. And then the little call out towards the bottom there shows 2 fields that we added to this particular application as custom local fields. So you can add properties to the local application in the scope of Dog Biscuits. So what Dog Biscuits is then, just to summarize, it's a source of richer models for hierarchies. It's easy to use across multiple repositories. It's configurable to meet local needs. It is being used in production, and it's working well for us. And it's in the Samvera Labs GitHub organization, and that I did that principally to make it easier for the community to contribute or review or use, just to try and make it more transparent and open to additional eyes. What Dog Biscuits isn't is it isn't fully featured. So, for example, it doesn't support more complex metadata, so like a name with a first name and surname part. It isn't a way of doing that initial modeling and specification work, so that making the choices of predicates and things like that still has kind of done outside of Dog Biscuits, and that's where M3 comes in. And then it isn't dynamic in the way that Ned's Scooby Snacks is, which it's loaded on when you start the application with Scooby Snacks. There's a lot of code in Dog Biscuits. And then it's not automatically applied to new models in the way that archetypes can be, and Randall will talk about that in a moment. So I don't know if we have Ned in the participants list. If someone could just ping me in the Slack to let me know if Ned's around. Doesn't look like he's been able to make it. So I'll just say a tiny bit about Scooby Snacks, just based on what I know. So I know that Ned sort of took the ideas of Dog Biscuits, but he made it more dynamic. So instead of lots and lots of code sitting in a gem, in Ned's work, there's a configuration file that defines the properties, predicates, all that kind of thing. And then that's read into the application at runtime. And so it's more dynamic. It's an approach that I never thought of when I designed Dog Biscuits, and I can see the benefits because it lowers the barrier for metadata librarians being able to contribute to that modeling side. They don't have to write Ruby code, they just have to write a configuration code, a piece of configuration code. So this is Ned's sample metadata YML. So this is how properties would be defined. And this work has informed a lot of what we've been doing in M3, which you'll find out more about later. And then this is quite a nice slide. I really like this because, as I mentioned earlier, anyone who's dealt with the catalog controller file in Hierarchs knows that it's quite complicated. And what Ned's done, if you look on the right-hand side, is he's stripped that right down. So it's much, much cleaner and much, much easier to configure. And then this just shows how it's quite easy to make changes to the configuration in GitHub. And with that, I will mute myself and hand over to Randall.
Thank you. So, well, it looks like we have quite a bit more time than I thought we were going to have. I went a little light on talking about our experiences and solutions that we have come up with. I didn't do a lot of detailed slides showing some of our back-end pieces and stuff like that because I wasn't sure how much time we would have. I will say that unlike Dog Biscuits and even Scooby Snacks, ours isn't quite as prime time looking as theirs is. Ours isn't quite production, and it's certainly not community. If Scooby Snacks kind of plays on the Scooby-Doo theme, I would say ours is maybe more like Shaggy. But anyway, so Indiana University has been kind of playing around with this idea, even going all the way back to pre-curation concerns, even with Worthwhile, if you remember going back even that far in the community. So we had some experiences with that in a Worthwhile-based application. So we've been playing around with crafty ways to try to configure metadata and get around the development burden that Julie has talked about. And like the others, everything was kind of predicated on this idea of YAML configuration. And ours was structured based on work types. And I didn't go to the trouble to show what that looked like. So like I said, I didn't know what kind of time I would have at the end here, but our structure was keyed on work types, and within that structure, there was a lot of detail about like what kind of behaviors a work type would have. So like particular properties and attributes about like, say for example, whether a property would be in search results versus just a detail view, and whether it was it's indexing attributes and things like that. So lots of different behaviors within the application would be within this structure. display labels, that kind of thing, the things that you might, that might immediately come to mind. Ours is kind of a hybrid of the things that have been talked about already between Scooby Snacks and Dog Biscuits. Ours, we tried to make largely dynamic. We actually went so far at first as to even make the models dynamic from configuration, which actually worked, but was kind of dicey. So we backed away from that a little bit, but we did and still do make our the UI part as dynamic as possible. So all the way through the UI, like the presenter's views, the catalog controller, all those pieces are dynamically rigged from the configuration files as much as possible. But the models and behaviors are coming from mix-ins, which are companion pieces that are companion to the configuration files. But a twist for us is that we want to be able to share behaviors of closely related things or closely related work types. So we started coming up with this idea of archetypes. So when we created a new work type, we wanted to be able to say that it was a kind of an existing work type, so that it would get those shared behaviors in addition to its own behaviors. And so slide, please. Thank you. So we added this concept of archetypes, and just the word archetype in general, meaning the idealized version of something. So in our application, an archetype is a work type. It's a valid work type, but it's one that represents the ideal or the archetypal version of that work type. So it's a work type whose speciality behaviors are coded as mix-in modules. An archetype is a work type whose mix-ins can then be also included back into other work types. So you kind of get the idea here. That's okay, you can go ahead. Thank you. So you kind of get the idea that it is a kind of special, it's a valid work type, but it's a special kind of work type that has all of its behaviors in mix-ins that it uses, but that can be used in other work types. So we even went so far as to hack the Hyrax work type generator. So for Hyrax developers or Hyrax administrators would recognize this command here. This is the work type generator that you would use to create a new work type. But we added the ability to specify two different things. One, that you're creating an archetype, and two, that you can base a new work type on an archetype. So in the first invocation, we're saying that the work type paged resource is going to be an archetype based on the flag archetype. And so what's happening there that I've suppressed in the output is that a bunch of different module mix-ins are being stubbed in there. Classes are being stubbed in there, and those classes would then be would then be available for developers to go in and start to develop around and add meaning to and extend and make it add the specialities to. Excuse me. And then in the second invocation, the work type special book is being told that it's going to be based on the archetype paged resource. You can see the info line there that says the behaviors of page resource are being added to special book. So then special book can also be modified according to its specialities, but then it will also contain the behaviors of paged resource. So as page resource evolves with, as developers continue to modify and grow its mix-in behaviors, special book will continue to evolve with it. So that was the idea. It's still, like we say, it's something that hasn't exactly reached prime time. There are impacts of that. One being that in the persistence, the content types that are persisted are the work type name and not the archetype name. And so these closely related things don't end up being named by the archetype, and that has impact if you're trying to think about how you would construct searches and things like that. So there are impacts to this that we're thinking about, and so this is something that we aren't necessarily advocating for in like a community adoption of a component or something. So this has, this is something that we're still thinking about how this actually should work. But we do still have this need to say that we want to say something is like something else. We just need to think closely about like what mechanism we hang that on. So anyway, that's our experiences with, thinking about how to make it easy to get around this issue that Julie outlined of all the different various things you have to touch in order just to add some different metadata components. But what I really want to talk about mostly next is how the work of the M3 group is trying to work towards addressing this problem, because those of us that have worked in this area and have talked so far are actually part of this group. And so getting back to M3 and how it relates to HIRAX, first, I wanted to start off with the definition in case you're not aware of this group or have followed it at all. So first, the definition. So M3 is the Machine Readable Metadata Modeling Specification Working Group. And so you can see why we chose the short form of M3. Otherwise, nobody would follow us because nobody wants to pronounce a whole sentence the whole time or anytime anybody's trying to refer to us. So it's, I think, useful to try to repeat real quickly this blurb from the wiki page, because it describes very well what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So there have been a number of projects, discussions, brainstorming around better ways to define, document, and use metadata models. This working group will develop a draft specification, this is the important part, a draft specification for a machine-readable format for metadata modeling, which can be used to generate human and user-facing documentation, batch data entry templates, and define system functionality, and maybe more. Slide, please. Thank you. And so our discussion so far has been specifically about HIRAX and difficulties with metadata, but the M3 effort aims to solve a problem at a much broader and higher level. So we want a solution around metadata modeling that is much more useful around more than just a single application. We want something that is useful in much broader context and different communities and in totally different scenarios, other than just trying to make metadata easy in HIRAX, if that makes any sense. Slide, please. Thank you. So the M3 deliverables are to develop a data dictionary for metadata properties, and I'll make sure I understand what that is in a minute, that can be used to generate documentation, configure applications, generate code, and then to define format agnostic structure, syntax requirements, identify serializations and file formats, and this is important, create example data dictionaries like the HIRAX metadata application profile, for example. Slide, please. Thank you. And so this is what the developers in this group, in the M3 group, have been thinking about as this specification emerges. And that is, how do we pull together our individual experiences and our experiments in this area, trying to solve this problem? How do we pull our efforts together and our code bases together, try to align something? How can we contribute something to the Samvera community that uses this specification, uses these data dictionaries, to provide something specific that is a component specific to HIRAX, to provide a flexible metadata component to do something like what Julie has shown, something for Dog Biscuits, for Scooby Snacks, something like what I talked about, but that is common, that is blessed and accepted for usage within HIRAX. Slide, please. Try to make this quick so we have some Q&A if there's any. So I think it's really useful to see a snippet of one, and that would allow, I think, HIRAX developers to get it, I think, fairly quickly. This is just kind of a snippet showing, like, for example, a creator. This comes directly from the current example. If you're a HIRAX developer thinking about like how you would create a component to dynamically rig some UI components to do some views and forms, or generate some models, you can kind of pick out the pieces that you would need from that, like display labels, the property URIs, where your predicate's going to come from, cardinality, is it going to be single or multi-valued, your index behaviors, things like that. You can see the pieces that you would need. So this, if you're thinking about what would be a great place to start for something to create a component like that, this is going to be a really great place to start. And this is also going to be the place to start that somebody else is going to be using to create for other contexts and other scenarios. So I'm going to try to speed things along here. Slide, please. Yeah, so the developers here want to make it very clear, though, that we're still letting the specification come first. We're on the group to help make sure that the format is useful. We're not being prescriptive yet as to what this component should look like. We're not trying to think for the group at large. We're not trying to develop or write anything yet. So we definitely welcome feedback, welcome new developer participation. So if you want to follow M3, slide please. Here's how to follow M3, all the relevant pages. And that is all I have.
I understand there's one question and it's being addressed in Slack, but I'm going to read it out loud anyway for those not following on Slack. Lynette asks, for Dog Biscuits in the config, is there a way to identify properties as required versus optional, which for HIRAX means above the fold or behind the fold, i.e. only shown when user clicks the additional fields button? I probably did the context of that and syntax all wrong.
Yes, there is. So in the slide earlier where there was on the right hand side, it said, is it journal article properties equals? There's also a journal article required properties equals, and it defaults to the default set defined in the underlying application, but you can override it with like minus or add, or just completely replace it with a new set of required. So yes.
I think Kate and Rebecca are indicating that's it for questions. So thank y'all so much for being brave and doing the first long presentation of the day. Much appreciated. And with that, we are going to move on to our lightning talks. There are community notes for this. Please participate in that. And the first participants are going to be Rethinking Metadata Design and Management with Arwen and Ruth.
Hi, thanks, Ryan. This is Arwen. Ruth helped write the presentation, but she is unable to be here today. So let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see that? So this lightning talk is kind of a companion to the previous presentation. It's looking at some of the same work from a metadata analyst perspective and highlighting some of the challenges that we run into beyond the issues that ran Julie and Ned already discussed, and how the M3 specification work could improve metadata design and modeling. So I'd like to start by quoting the previous presentation. Metadata modeling is hard and time consuming. And I read this in the draft presentation and was like, yes, amen. It's very true. So this is true both for developers who are implementing the model within the system, as well as metadata specialists creating the model. There's a lot of decisions that need to be made, and including defining system requirements for how properties function, as well as how they should be used by metadata creators. And what better way to do this, to develop a good profile or model, than by drawing on the work already done in the community, either by adopting or adapting a model created by someone else, or looking at how you can align your model with another institutions to better use best practices and create more agreement between them. And this kind of collaborative approach is especially attractive within the Samvera community because of the promise of being able to then use community developed tools. And there's been a great deal of work within this community and in other communities towards these goals of alignment and sharing of models. And some of this work has happened as part of the metadata interest group, defining profiles and sharing different profiles for different work types, looking at the core metadata that's within the system and what's available in the initial installations and those kinds of things. And the work also has happened in other collaborations between individual institutions, looking at aligning their models or taking advantage of that shared knowledge. So while this work has, I think, borne a lot of fruit, the process is still hard and time consuming. And so some of the recurring obstacles we've seen doing this kind of work over the years is there's three that I'm going to highlight. One of them is terminology differences. So this idea of how we describe a property and what it does and what it is can vary. So even when we're talking about the same things, sometimes we don't know it, or sometimes we think we're talking about the same things and we aren't. And so reconciling these language differences across multiple institutions can take in a remarkable amount of time. So when a project is trying to look at comparison, you can spend a great deal of time either at the outset or during the process kind of clarifying and making sure you're on the same page with the terminology you're using. Another of the issues is the challenges of sharing and reusing, because there's no standard format for documenting profiles or data dictionaries. And it can vary widely from formal OWL ontologies to spreadsheets to Word documents to almost anything. And usually, even if you can share, there's some local modifications, even if it's a small change to relatively insignificant change, like a display label or something. And so despite our best efforts, it's difficult to kind of share these documents in a consistent way or reuse them. So most metadata analysts at some point in their career have asked themselves, do I really have to create this from scratch again? So the third issue is documentation. So we need documentation to support all of this. Lots and lots of documentation for ourselves, for other metadata specialists, for developers, self-depositors, catalogers. And these different audiences need different kinds of documentation, from data dictionaries to usage guidelines or helper text, controlled value lists, ingest templates, and more. Creating all of this documentation is time consuming, and maintaining it and keeping it all in sync is even more difficult. So put it all together and we sometimes feel like we're playing whack-a-mole. And so how are we hoping the metadata, the M3 work can help this specification? For one, it's looking at developing a shared terminology, that we have some agreement on some of these core things used to describe how properties function. And this can improve communication between metadata analysts and between metadata analysts and developers. So this is a little, one of the things is the saying minimum occurrence or minimum and maximum for cardinality. And there's a little sample of the spreadsheet, which is in develop in a brainstorming space, so none of it's set yet, on the bottom of this slide. The other thing is a standardized syntax. So not only knowing, being familiar with the format and being able to quickly kind of look at someone else's profile or model, but also being able to treat it more like code. So it's versionable, it's easier to see and track changes through comparing differences, and updates or changes can be managed with some similar tools and workflows as code changes are. So all of this, we believe, will make it easier to share and reuse models. And then finally, the idea of being able to automatically generate some of the documentation we need. So being able to generate from the specific M3 encoded metadata model, human readable documentation in a number of different formats, which can then be regenerated when there's changes made and reduce the drift and out of syncness that we get with manually updated documentation. And we're hoping that by another hope is that by having a standardized encoding format, we'll also be able to share and reuse the templates for rendering. So this is a early kind of prototype of Jekyll rendering of a YAML encoded model. So what's next? There's a working group. The working group's still ongoing. There's going to be an update later in the day to give a little bit more information. But basically, if you're interested, one of the things we're trying to do is take samples of metadata models encoded in the format to kind of test it out and see where things break and what needs to be fixed or addressed. So if you're interested in marking up some of a data model of yours and test running it, that would be really helpful. And also, if you're interested in creating rendering templates and style sheets or scripts or whatever, because it's not just limited to Jekyll for the possibilities, those would be also very useful and in general feedback. And I think I'm done.
All right, well, thank you, Arwen. That was fantastic. Next up is making hierarchs more inclusive through controlled vocabulary choice with Julie H. from Indiana. We will be holding all questions to the end, but do post your questions into Slack and into the Zoom webinar chat.
Hi, I am sharing my screen and getting this set up here for, here we go. All right. Hi, my name is Julie Hardesty, and I'm the metadata analyst at Indiana University Libraries. I'm also a co-facilitator for the Samvera Metadata Interest Group. The topics of bias and inclusivity in metadata are areas of research I've been investigating along with others here at IU and across the library community. From the abstract for this talk, I proposed a question about hierarchs supplying and supporting controlled vocabularies from marginalized communities. I want to spend the next few minutes talking about how we can do this. As a white woman, I mostly match all the categories that are in those mainstream categories listed in the abstract, but I am working to understand what it means to not match most of those mainstream categories or any of those mainstream categories and how that impacts the research process, particularly discovery and information retrieval. I'm proposing an idea about how we as a community are providing the software, and I think that there's a way to make hierarchs a more inclusive repository management application. So we already talk about Samvera as being software that is an ecosystem meant to fit a variety of users' needs and workflows, which means to me that we have an aim for inclusivity. In addition, we also already have Hyrax with its capabilities for customizable descriptive metadata. When we consider what we're providing with Hyrax out of the box, however, there are very few controlled source fields with vocabularies behind them, and there are no controlled vocabularies behind the keyword field or the subject field. That's by design, and it's meant to offer the ability for supplying any kind of term needed as a keyword or subject. But I want to propose that we consider a different strategy that presents a more proactive and inclusive set of metadata options. In looking for available options for vocabularies created to represent historically marginalized communities that are considered other by mainstream vocabularies such as the Library of Congress subject headings, it turns out that there are a lot of choices that have been created and used over time by different cultural heritage organizations and academic institutions. Some of these, like the Women's Thesaurus from Atria, the Institute on Gender Equality and Women's History in the Netherlands, are available in an online format and are being used locally, but are not available as linked data yet. At least one of these vocabularies, homosaurus.org, an LGBTQ plus controlled vocabulary, is available now as linked data. This list linked here is definitely not complete, but it's a start to identify better vocabulary options to provide for describing people, groups, and communities. I think Hyrax as a software application already has the capability to offer controlled vocabulary choices from these sources based on those that are available now as linked data and even those that are available online but are not yet in linked data form. Within Hyrax, offering a configurable selection of controlled vocabularies for keyword, subject, or both of those fields would allow a way to provide various options like these vocabularies. It would likely be restricted to one vocabulary per field, which would mean mapping properties based on vocabulary source. So a linked data source would map to a subject or keyword property that takes a URI as a value, and a non-linked data source would map the subject or keyword field to a property that doesn't require a URI value. Supplying a set of subject and keyword fields pre-configured with Hyrax upon install also seems like a way to provide examples of how controlled vocabulary options could be used in practice. Another possible approach is to consider using the questioning authority gem to supply connections to these controlled vocabulary options. QA can be configured to connect to linked data sources or read from locally supplied vocabularies, which might allow more flexibility in how controlled vocabulary options are provided. If, for example, a vocabulary is not available as linked data now, but becomes available in linked data form in the future, these changes might be easier to update in this gem rather than in the Hyrax codebase. The work involved here is increasing the vocabulary options available to QA from the start when it is installed. This also expands where these vocabulary options are available beyond Hyrax, since QA can be implemented as a gem in Rails applications outside of Hyrax. I'm thinking of these as opportunities or possible ways to move forward, and there might be more here than what I'm listing, but I'm seeing that there are currently few vocabularies available as linked data that are representing terminology from marginalized communities. I think some of what we can do is outreach to the vocabulary sources to find out about the status of those vocabularies and if linked data is in the works for any of them, because I think that might be the case. Also, are there possibilities for Samvera to support these vocabulary sources, either as linked data or as vocabulary terms that can be used within Rails applications? I'm thinking specifically of the Samvera Community Vocabulary Manager that's been proposed by the Samvera Metadata Interest Group. And don't get too excited by that link. It's just to the functional requirements. The service doesn't really exist yet. I'm also wondering if something usable in Rails applications along the lines of the RDF vocab gem that sets up properties available as linked data is something that can be used for vocabulary terms like these, where they can then be used as object values. So if you want to discuss why it's important to provide and expand on the controlled vocabulary choices available for use in Hyrax, consider who you are in regards to race, gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and religion. The fact that we have these categorizations applied to people and you know what you are in those terms shows the impact of that kind of metadata. These categories have been used to define what is mainstream or normal or default, and identifies who has historically controlled our categorization and organization practices, particularly in the United States. It reveals who has power. The controlled vocabularies we support and supply in our software can reinforce those practices by only supporting those mainstream vocabulary choices, or it can work to mitigate that marginalization by incorporating and supporting these vocabulary choices and centering those communities who have historically been marginalized in cataloging practice. It offers a way in for those who are not able to see themselves in the online collections they're trying to research, and it offers a way for those unfamiliar with those communities to learn and remove that fake shell of otherness. Offering these options shows what I would think of as the true spirit of Samvera, or being together, and enhances the utility of HIRACs for institutional repositories and digital collection management. So it's kind of big, but I think it's a possible idea. If you're interested, I'll see if this can be on the next agenda for the Samvera Metadata Interest Group meeting on Tuesday, May 28th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Or we can discuss on Samvera Slack in the metadata channel, or you can contact me directly. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Next up, we have Catherine and John from Georgia State talking about from institutional repository to digital collections management, replacing Content DM with Samvera HIRACs.
All right, can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good deal. All right, so hi, I'm John Bodner, and I'm the Library Technology Project Manager and Web Services Unit Lead at the Georgia State University Library. And as was mentioned, I'm here with Catherine Michaelis, and she's the library's digital project coordinator. Today, we're just going to review some work that we're doing to move from Content DM to Samvera HIRACs as our digital asset management system. I'm just going to give some background on our digital collections and the projects, and the project itself, and then Catherine will discuss some of the features we've focused on developing. The presentations, it's fairly high level, but we hope it would really be useful for someone who is considering developing Samvera HIRACs as a DAMs or as a replacement for Content DM. So, change the slide here. So, under Catherine's directions, the library here has an active digitization program. Our digital collections, if you're interested in looking at them later, are at digitalcollections.gsu.edu. It houses over 90,000 items, including photos, foldered archival material, publications, maps, audio and visual material, and a number of oral histories. The digitization program's workflow relies on mass digitization of entire collections, so the efficient bulk upload and processing of items is something that's really important to us. We also have a long-standing active oral history program. We add between 100 and 200 oral history interviews to our digital collections every year. We use the oral history metadata synchronizer, or OHMS, to provide access to the oral histories. Since about the mid-2000s, we've used Content DM to give access to our digital collections, and in 2016, we had a group that convened to investigate a replacement for Content DM. That group operated for a while, went through a few iterations, was suspended at one point because of competing priorities, and it eventually chose Samvera as our replacement for Content DM, really focusing on the customizability aspect. For the project itself, the Web Services Unit has been working with Catherine and one of her employees on the project. The units had a team of 3 programmers tasked with building and maintaining the new system. One of them was devoted full time to the project, and the others are working part-time on it, and it's still ongoing. So now I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, and she'll discuss some of the features that she's found important for us to focus on.
So the features that I'm going to talk about today are our controlled vocabulary support, our oral history ingest and display functionality, and our bulk uploading functionalities. So as far as controlled vocabulary support, in the past, we relied very heavily on the controlled vocabulary feature in Content DM, and it's informed a lot of our decision-making around metadata creation. But problems have arisen because of the highly manual nature of the CDM vocabularies. If an authorized term changes, for example, when someone dies and a death date is added to their authorized name term, all occurrences of that term have to be updated manually, one collection at a time, which leads to a lot of inconsistencies and inaccuracies building up over time. We've also had problems with reconciling local terms against established authorities. To solve these problems, one of our programmers created an importer to work with the questioning authority gem that would allow terms to be imported to a local database from the Library of Congress and combined with a list of our local terms, and the combined list is what's queried. When a user inputs a value in a field governed by a CV, the LOC terms are queried first and then the local terms, and they're separated out in the results, as you can see in the screenshot. Some of our CVs are contain terms that are all locally derived, like series, collection, and neighborhood. When we edit a term in one of our local CVs, all the occurrences of it in metadata across the system are updated automatically. And every 3 months, our digital collections email address will receive a report containing all the terms in the CV fields that don't conform to either the external or local CVs, so that we can stay on top of any inaccuracies. So the oral history ingest and display is something that we've worked on quite a bit. Like John mentioned, here at Georgia State, oral history interviews, of which we have a lot, are either indexed or synced with a transcript using OHMs, and an XML file is output from OHMs containing the metadata and the sync or index data for each interview. Our current workflow, which is not super efficient, usually involves a graduate student syncing or indexing an interview and creating metadata in the OHMs backend, and then me either copying or pasting the metadata for an individual interview into Content DM, or exporting a handful of XML files from OHMs and massaging the output so that it fits our CDM template, and then uploading the badge. In the new system, I'll be able to export the XML from OHMs and upload it directly using the highlighted link shown in the task menu on the left. And all of the metadata fields from the XML file will automatically populate the corresponding fields in hierarchs. It also has the ability to multi-select XMLs to upload so that we'll be able to do them in batches. We've also worked on customizing the OHMs viewer for our hierarchs instance. This is what our current OHMs and Content DM viewer looks like. We've been using the out-of-the-box OHMs viewer iframed into the Content DM display for quite a while. It's kind of clunky and it doesn't work great on mobile devices. So for those reasons and some others, we decided to get rid of the out-of-the-box viewer and to recreate it from scratch just to make it look a little bit better. So this is what the new viewer looks like. It retains the essential functionality of the old one while providing a more elegant and mobile-friendly display. The main difference is that instead of having the sync points show up in the left-hand margin, that they're hyperlinked inline on the text that they correspond to, and a tooltip appears when you hover over the link text to let you know where you are in the transcript. We came up with a few different options for how we could present this information, the new viewer display, and after consulting with some archivists and librarians on our staff, we decided to go with this manner. So like John mentioned earlier, we mostly engage in mass digitization of archival collections, and as such, the ability to bulk or batch upload content is absolutely necessary for us. Since out-of-the-box hierarchs does not include a bulk upload functionality, our programmers built a bulk upload generator that works through the user interface. And they also added some additional functionality, like creating this list of bulk upload templates within the hierarchs dashboard in an effort to encourage creating standardized metadata. So whenever you click on the word template under the template link heading, you'll download a spreadsheet containing a metadata template that corresponds to each work type so that there's no need to reinvent the wheel every time you're creating a new collection. This is the bulk upload creation form that our programmers created in the dashboard. And every time a new bulk upload is created, it goes into a queue where we can go into one bulk upload at a time and either edit it or upload all the items to a collection where they go through an approval queue before they're officially added and indexed to the collection. These are only a few of the features that we decided as a group were necessary for us to develop before we could go into production, but we decided to focus on these today because they're some of the most significant and most complex. Once we get the system up and running as a Content DM replacement, we plan to look at other types of content that we could potentially host in the system, like Born Digital archival material and our institutional repository content. Thank you.
So yeah, so that's all we had.
All right. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Next up is introducing Newspaper Works with Evan English from the Boston Public.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about Newspaper Works. So this is a gem that provides content models, batch ingest, and front-end behavior that's specifically tailored to digitize newspaper content. It's designed to work with any Hyrax-based repository application, through a pretty, hopefully pretty basic install process. This is an IMLS funded grant project that is a collaboration between BPL and University of Utah, and began in July 2017, and the grant is scheduled to wrap up in June 2019, which is when we're hoping to release a 1.0 version. So you can find us online, github.com, Marriott Library, Newspaperworks. That's where we're at. So I mentioned content models. So basically the GEM provides 5 different content models for title, which is basically like a publication like the New York Times, a container, which could be a microfilm reel or a bound volume, an issue, which is obviously like a single issue of a newspaper, a page, which is part of an issue, and down to the article level. And I won't go into detail on that enjoyable PCDM diagram there. So, you can basically create any of these through the UI. Typically the typical Hyrax workflow that you would see for other types of works. We have done a lot of work on the metadata around these object types, creating custom fields that are tailored to those objects. This is just a small sample of what you might see in the edit form. So things like the ISSN, Library of Congress control number, volume, issue number, edition, frequency of publication, preceding title, following title, all that good stuff is in there. We also have a controlled vocabulary of article types that you can use to create a taxonomy in a facet browse in the search interface as well. We're obviously aware that most people are not, when it comes to newspapers, most people are not creating objects one by one in the UI. It's a batch ingest kind of a game. So the batch ingest use cases that we're hoping to support as of the 1.0 release are PDF issues. So if you have a PDF that represents an issue, which is a pretty common use case for student newspapers and things like that. NDNP batches, which is the National Digital Newspaper Program. That's a more widespread historical newspaper digitization format, as well as just TIFF master image files. And then we're hoping to support some other things in the future, but those will be a little bit down the road. The PDF ingest, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about it. This is something we worked a lot on, is basically when you upload a PDF that's an issue, the ingest process splits the issue, splits the PDF into its component pages, and then creates a bunch of derivatives for each page. So it creates JP2, Alto, XML, it performs the OCR, it creates a text file. It also creates a JSON word coordinate file. And so all that stuff supports the front end, being able to use the universal viewer, as well as being able to do searching of the OCR. So the full text search, this is just a screenshot. This is the basic universal viewer full text search behavior. So basically this is driven by a gem called Blacklight IIIF search that was developed as part of this project, but it's its own project. This basically adds IIIF content search support to Blacklight and Solar applications. So if you're familiar with IIIF, you might know about the image API and the presentation API. The search API is just a standardized way of searching the full text of a resource, basically. So it's intended to be pretty customizable and configurable, since we know that people have different ways of representing OCR content in their repositories. So that's another thing to check out. Just going to cover some of the front end features just real quick here. This is not going to be comprehensive, but basically we have, looking at ways to provide interaction that's specific to newspapers. So one of the ways is to browse by a calendar. This is something you see in other newspaper content systems. Here are some of the other features we have planned: full text highlighting in the search results, being able to search within a specific publication, semantic URLs. Sorry, I'm just opening up my chat here, sorry. Semantic URLs is a feature that the Library of Congress Chronicling America project provides. It's basically a way to provide a URL that's not just a kind of a system identifier. Advanced searching for newspapers, limiting the search to front pages only, being able to download a clipped image segment. Those are all things that we're planning on supporting in the front end. So if you're interested in the project, I encourage you to come to the newspaper's interest group meetings. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that in the interest group updates later. We also have all of our documentation is accessible, including that PCDM profile, the requirements that we had gathered as part of the beginning of the planning process, the metadata profile, some of the ingest scenario documentation, as well as sample materials. We have a Google Drive where we've gotten people to contribute their digitized newspaper content so we can basically build batch ingest workflows around these types of samples, whether they're NDNP or PDF issues or content DM exports or Olive or Viridian, all those kinds of things we're gathering there. We actually have a separate gem that just provides the fixtures for testing and things like that as well. If you're interested, we have a Vagrant box that allows you to basically run the latest version of the code and all the components that you need. There's also a test site, which is still kind of a work in progress, but it does provide that PDF ingest functionality that I mentioned before. So that's available. We'll be updating that periodically and sending out notifications about when that's available or when new features are available on that test site. And that is about all I have for you about Newspaperworks for today.
Thanks, Evan. Next up is actually me, so give me a moment to get my screen switched around here a bit. Hi, I'm Ryan Steens, Community Manager for Avalon Media System. Avalon is a Samvera solution bundle that specializes in managing and hosting audio and video. Today, Avalon 7 is under development. We're currently scheduled for release at the beginning of 2020 and will continue to report on progress via our various outreach channels. Version 7 will achieve feature parity with Avalon 6 while re-architecting Avalon to base it upon Hyrax and other shared Samvera infrastructure. In the past, Avalon was something of a standalone solution bundle, but going forward, Avalon will exist as a series of components, relying upon Hyrax and Samvera framework for much of the stack. As we now look to Hyrax and Samvera's various technologies for the base of our solution bundle, we've become deeply involved in several activities across the Samvera community, and I think you're going to hear about those throughout the day in various capacities. The past year, we've been able to participate significantly with Hyrax work in planning and development, assisted with Valkyrie, and been involved in several other Samvera projects, which we hope is mutually beneficial for everybody. With this re-architecting, you won't necessarily have to stand up a full Avalon solution bundle. Some features will be available as discrete components. So if you prefer a standalone stack for AV, that will be officially Avalon 7.
Ryan,
but if you prefer, yeah.
You do not have your screen up.
I don't have my screen up?
Yeah.
Sorry, man, no one can see your slides.
Thank you.
There we go.
All right. Thank you. Of all the people to do it, huh?
Yep.
Where was I? If you prefer a standalone stack for AV, that will be officially Avalon 7. If you prefer, you can pull components providing specific features and apply them to your local Hyrax or Samvera repository. And because we've been asked, yes, we'll be supporting 6 for some time to come. And also, yes, the team will be creating migration scripts to get you from 6 to 7. We need them, and as in all things Avalon, we're going to be happy to share. This list describes just some of the work of the past 12 months. I'm going to go through this stuff. I'm not sure it demonstrates how busy we've actually been. It also doesn't necessarily reflect the metadata work we've been doing all across the Samvera community. Most of the features you see here will be available in both 6 and 7. IIIF embedding. As we've moved to adopting IIIF, Avalon now generates JSON that can be utilized to embed your Avalon media into IIIF compliant viewers. You have some flexibility in your selection of viewers, and we plan to remain at the leading edge of IIIF for time-based media and embedding options. Today, players such as Universal Viewer can be used in conjunction with this feature. Waveform and structural metadata editor. We've been developing a structural metadata editor that enables you to create navigation for your media. It's really neat, but our team's presenting on this next, so I'm moving on. ADA compliance. We're all very concerned with ADA compliance and ensuring our repositories work for everybody. While Avalon has long allowed for closed captioning, our front-end developers are in the process of making sure our GUI surpasses minimum qualifications for compliance. We need for everybody to be able to navigate and use Avalon in all of the Samvera and Hyrax repositories. Batch upload. As you can guess, when considering uploads, the team at WGBH and the American Archive of Public Broadcasting need to work at scale. A while back, Avalon developers paired with the team at WGBH and also AVP to improve the batch upload process for Avalon. Sadie Russa is going to talk about the resulting work tomorrow, so please stay tuned for that presentation. Avalon's also delivering the Timeliner tool, and we'll discuss this detail in a later presentation, but we're really excited about this visualization tool and how it can be used in learning and research. Transcode dashboard. This feature is under development, but we hope you get the idea from maybe taking a look at this image, which I'm actually sharing. Currently, when a file is sent to Avalon for transcoding, it can feel like a bit of a black box. You sort of wait, and eventually you get a thumbs up from the system or you get an error. But soon, repo managers will be able to see the progress of a video sent to Avalon for transcoding, and you'll see it in this tidy little dashboard that'll tell you where you're at. As someone who uploads content to Avalon, I am very happy this is coming. You just heard about OHMS from Georgia State. The oral history metadata synchronizer is an external application developed out of Kentucky. Last year, Indiana paired with AVP to make it possible to embed and play Avalon media in the OHMS application, making Avalon a sensible destination for oral history recordings. You can house your media in Avalon and then perform your oral history work, all that structural metadata stuff, in the familiar OHMS suite of tools. Archivematica to Avalon. As part of an IMLS grant, we're very close to delivering Archivematica to Avalon integration. Soon, archivists will be able to create packages of files and metadata, and using a single workflow, they'll be able to move content through to Archivematica for the preservation work into Avalon for access to videos and audio as a final product. In the next few months, expect delivery of documentation, scripts, and prescribed workflows developed at Archivematica. So what's coming? Avalon is very much in deep development, creating feature parity between new and old features in 6 and 7. Hong is working on Dockerizing Avalon for deployment. We have work to do in key areas like permissions and unpublishing a work. And of course, we want to make sure the UI works for everybody. And before we can call it a day on 7, there's significant work in creating documentation and everything else necessary for a numbered release. So as we head towards January, February 2020, start looking for that content to start coming out. Avalon is becoming a community, and we really would like for you to join us. We're establishing 2 roundtable efforts currently. One's for users, and there's a second for administrators, both to consider sustainability and teamwork for Avalon as a solution bundle. In addition to me, of course, there's the whole Avalon team, and we are all ready to help you out. The last year, we've stepped up our outreach and communication work, and today we've got this full menu you're looking at of options where you can communicate with the Avalon team. Please know we're here to help you investigate and stand up Avalon. We'd love to help out, make sure you have the support you need as you're standing it up. don't just take a look at Avalon without asking questions. That's what we're here for. If you're looking for a feature that's not there, let us know. We're absolutely here to help. In the next few years, we hope more of you will consider Avalon and come to join our sub-community within Samvera. And that is about it. We have a lot of other coverage of Avalon work that's about to come up, so I'm going to cut it short here. Thanks so much. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Adam.
All right. Share my screen here. Okay. Assuming everyone can hear me okay. My name is Adam Arling, and I'll be co-presenting this with Dhananjay Vitana, and we're both front-end developers on the Avalon Media System project. And about the past 6 months or so, we've been working on a project for Avalon refactoring the structural metadata editor. And we'll give a little brief overview of the work we've done and where it's going. So just a brief outline of kind of what we'll be discussing if anyone wants to check out the slide deck later, but we'll just touch upon what is a structural metadata editor, why we've been working on developing it, what's the tech behind it, what packages or libraries does it use, and where does it currently live, and where will it live in the future. So to kick us off, we'll just go over a brief overview prepared by Dhananjay on what is the structural metadata editor.
Yes, Adam. So this video contains all the actions that one can perform on metadata in the structural metadata editor. The application has two data sources, the waveform and the structure. Both of them are served as JSON files by a backend server. So the editor enables adding and editing headings and timestamps as list items. Each of these items can be edited and deleted once they are added into the structure. We are using inline forms for that, for each list item. For each time span, they can be moved using the drag and drop functionality embedded into those list items. And through all of these editing and moving and everything, the deleting functions, we manages the integrity of the data by validating each and every input that comes through the forms and the waveform interactions. So these validations ensure that none of the time spans overlap each other. And finally, this editor can save the edited structure back into a backend server. So this is how it looks like in action. Adam?
Okay. So continuing on with what the structural metadata is. So by itself, in development mode, it can be its own standalone application. So when we're working on it, the whole thing is bootstrapped with Create React App, and it can just live serverless, being fed by a Webpack dev server, and standard application structure has its own dependencies, its own testing. It can live by itself. But in thinking about how to implement this in the future, we're also exporting structural metadata editor as a React component, as an NPM module. So for example, if we want to pull this into Avalon 6, we can just simply import the NPM module, and with one line of code, we can include all the functionality that we just saw within the consuming application. And yeah, it's just a little, continuation of the visual of, importing the module into Avalon, for example, and, any logic, UI events or actions within either manipulating the waveform or in any of the inline form lines for time segments that can all stay within, I guess, the umbrella of the application itself. So why have we been working on this the past few months? I guess primarily it replaces a legacy XML structural metadata editor that's been in place in the past few Avalon releases. And a benefit of moving to the refactored version is that now we're able to interact with other APIs when we're, say, changing times on a time span or retitling segment titles or whatnot. Previously, the XML editor was kind of locked in its own box, and now with the refactored version, we'll be able to interact with other UI elements in the screen, such as like the waveform editor. It also gives users the ability to visualize more clearly the audio or video files that they're working with. So, for example, you can see like peak, or you can see, I guess, how kind of time gaps between different sections of your audio file. And I think it really allows the user to more granularly get in and update what they want. And another benefit, now we're processing JSON instead of XML, so it's easier to kind of work within the UI. Next, overview of what technologies that we use in developing the structural metadata editor, and I'll pass it back to Dhananjay.
Yes, Adam. So we're using React Redux as a state management tool. Redux is a predictable state container used in JavaScript applications, and React Redux is the official React binding for Redux. So in simple words, I would say this Redux store acts as a single source of truth for the data within the application. And the next one is the Pix.js library, JavaScript component that's been developed by BBC. We use this to visualize the waveform and make it available to be interacted to the user. So one of the major obstacles that we faced while integrating peaks into the React application was how to inject the peaks events that occur when the user interacts with it. So we are using RxJS. It's a reactive programming library using observers. It helps us to work with the asynchronous events that's imported from the React application. So that's how we deal with the peaks events within the React application. Adam?
Yep, and I think we're at time. So I'll wrap this up, but if anyone's interested in seeing any more about this, here's the GitHub URL of where the development's happening, and we'll post the slides to the slide deck.
Dhananjay and Adam, thank you so much. The next presentation is going to be Rob and Kevin at Notch 8 talking about Haiku, a multi-tenant ready-to-ship Samvera implementation.
Good morning. This is Kevin Kochansky. I'm client liaison here at Notch 8 in San Diego, and I work with Rob Kaufman, who is going to be talking about multi-tenancy in Haiku after the break. And I also work with Leanne Bradford, who will be talking to you tomorrow about some of the customization work she did for one of our pilot projects. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Haiku. It's been a pretty active time, and there are some significant updates lately. So we thought we'd give you a small intro to that. As most people on this call probably know a bit about Haiku, but it's a turnkey pre-generated Samvera application, which is built using Hyrax. And it comes with many default choices already in place. Haiku is a result of the IMLS grant-funded Hydra in a Box project, which was spearheaded in 2015 by Stanford University, DPLA, and Duraspace. Some things that have been going on with Haiku lately, in February 2019, it was promoted out of Samvera Labs. Some of the high-profile pilot projects that have been going on include Ubiquity Press working with the British Library on shared repositories for the British Library, British Museum, Tate Galleries, and some other institutions. Co-sector with the University of London worked with the King's Fund to build the King's Fund Digital Archive, and some of the contributions that they've made out of that include IIIF and Universal Viewer Support. Notch 8 is deep into 2 pilot projects, the first of which is with the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, also known as DORIS. We've been able to contribute some major bug fixes, and we've improved the single tenant version of Haiku through that. We've also worked on a joint project with the Private Academic Library Network of Indiana and the Pennsylvania Academic Library Consortium Incorporated. We call it PALNI-PALSI. And some of the things that we've been able to do for them include additional theming customization, which is what Leanne's going to talk about tomorrow, and also improved user management. And that project will help their member institutions have access to these Haiku implementations. In other news, Notch 8, we're rolling out our own hosted Haiku service in about 2 months, which is Haiku Up. So you'll probably be hearing more about that in the coming weeks. Notch 8 chairs the monthly Haiku interest group meeting. The interest group leads the Haiku roadmap, which can be found online. And one of the things that we've been doing as part of that effort is to try to align and consolidate the various web presences related to Haiku. Some of those resources online are a little bit out of date or maybe a little redundant. So we're just in the beginning stages of refreshing those and aligning that web presence. Also want to mention the Haiku mailing list, which has been created, Samvera Haiku. The easiest way to find that is probably just to Google Samvera Haiku mailing list. And you should certainly join that for updates and to add your voice to that forum. Some of the major work that is in development that can be found on the Haiku roadmap includes bulk import and export work. That would be to create the ability for bulk content ingest through an automated process. That's something that's been high on the wish list for some of the pilot partners. We're also looking to expand work types, expanding the number of available work types and the custom view ability for each tenant. I do want to share a few links, give a shout out to that Samvera annual report for 2018. If you haven't looked at that, you definitely should. I'm fairly new to this community myself, and it really helped my learning curve just to read through that. And some of these Haiku updates can be found in that report. The Duraspace Wiki has a Haiku page that we've started to update. Haiku can also be found on GitHub, of course. There's a link to the roadmap I mentioned, which is also on that Duraspace Wiki, and another link to the Samvera Haiku mailing list. My contact information is there. If you have any questions about the Haiku interest group or the mailing list, you can feel free to reach me, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for sticking this out. We're almost at the break.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I'm taking a look. I don't actually see any questions currently under the Lightning Talks question area. Yep, Rebecca is confirming that we have no questions at this time. So what I'm going to propose is that we go ahead and take our break, unless anybody wants to throw any questions our way. And I'm going to ask Chrissy to open her microphone and confirm what I'm about to say, that we will just pick up again at 1:30 Eastern, 12:30 Central.
That's right. That sounds great.
Okay.
Have a
We're starting in about 5 minutes, so if you can hear me, now's a good time to be claiming your seat. We're going to get going in about 2 minutes. Everybody, it is now 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Next up, as you can see, M3 and Hyrax. Whoops, that's not it at all. It's Rob talking about how multi-tenant works in Haiku from Notch 8. So with that, I know Rob is online. I'm going to mute myself.
Push the magic button to see if we can get a screen share going. All right. Can anyone confirm that they can see my screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, here we go. I'm Rob Kaufman from Notch 8. I'm talking a little bit about how multi-tenant is implemented in Haiku. The idea here is to give people both a just sort of a technical overview, but also a quick even for non-technical folks, so there's some idea of like how this thing is happening under the hood. So overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what multi-tenancy is. Then we're going to talk about how Haiku implements multi-tenancy, the apartment's gym, how Solar, Redis, and Fedora are dealt with in the multi-tenant environment, and then the single-tenant version. So what is multi-tenancy? So multi-tenancy is a single code base with one set or one application instance or set of application instances, but different views of that same application. So a common case for multi-tenancy is this thing called white labeling. So the idea behind white labeling is you might have a single application where different schools or different clients would see different UIs or different like labels. So some good examples of a multi-tenant application kind of in the wild is if you have like QuickBooks Online, like you're going to see a multi-tenant view of that. A lot of different web apps or SaaS applications, different users would see different views. So there are many data sets and many user interfaces, but one like running, in our case, Rails application stack. Again, this is a chance to differentiate on theme, but also there's an idea of data separation. So in a multi-tenant environment, there's one application instance, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the underlying data has to be in one data store. It is not uncommon for multi-tenant applications to share a database and just filter out the views. But inherently, anytime that gets messed up, what happens is you get data leakage. So we'll talk a little bit about what Haiku does differently there to prevent that sort of data linkage problem. So in Haiku, we start with the Hyrax codebase. So Haiku can be regularly updated to different versions of Hyrax, and we've been working to try and stay on top of that. And then each tenant ends up acting like an individual Hyrax instance. There are a few interface tweaks in addition, specifically things around how you would create a new tenant and how you might manage multiple tenants. But then there's also some other like feature additions. One of the goals of Haiku is to be able to test out new features for the Haiku specific audience before rolling them back up into the broader Hyrax audience. That idea of Haiku as a testbed for new features is something we've seen be really successful with things like IIIF support. So there's a lot of real excitement about having a off-the-shelf version of Hyrax that comes with things like the user models and sign-up flows and those things built in. It uses this thing called the apartments gym. And in the current setup, different subdomains have different tenants. So you might go to acme.haikuup.com to see the Acme University version of Haiku. And then you might go to, I don't know, some other universities. So let's say, just for random example, Yale.haikuup.com to see a Yale version. So any different tenant would have a different subdomain. And when you go to that domain, you see that subdomain, you see just their version of it. You don't see anyone else's works or anyone else's collections. It is possible for a developer to configure Haiku to use different methods. So you could say haikuup.com/acme and haikuup.com/marvel instead to go to different places. And there's 3 or 4 others that are supported by this apartments gym out of the box, or you can make what's called a custom elevator. So it is possible to not use subdomains, but the stock IQ prefers subdomains. And the apartment's gym isolates data so there's no potential or reduced potential for cross-contamination. So what you'll see as we dive in a little deeper here is that each of these databases, or each of these tenants, have a separate database that they connect to. And that means that we're much less likely to see, one person's collection or works for one university leak over into another, even in super admin type interfaces. So here's an example of a domain, and we'll see here that we have the subdomain part, the primary domain, and the TLD. And the big important key here is that this part, this subdomain piece, is what is going to be distinguishing one tenant from another. So the apartments gym, when Rails receives a request, when the running application receives a request, it looks for that subdomain and then loads the correct data connections based on it. The apartments gym provides 3 main functions, and I did want to say that sorry, I got a little distracted there. So just to point out here, this TLD stands for the top level domain. I spent an awful long part of my life thinking it stood for the 3-letter domain, but it's actually top level. And so the apartments gym provides us 3 primary functions. The first thing is that it can take a request and figure out which tenant to load via rack middleware. So before we even hit the Rails interface, it's already figured out which connections are the right connections for this specific tenant. It also knows how to connect to a given tenant and provides commands to switch them. So it may be very true on that you're on the command line, you need to run a migration on each tenant. So you can, do that based on functions the apartment gym gives you. And it provides helpers and active record extensions to maintain the various tenants and protect them from each other. So it's providing us some isolation and some helpers to make sure that when if we fail to load a tenant, that it doesn't just use the first tenant, or that one tenant can't necessarily write to the other tenant's database or see anything that they're seeing. I did want to point out that there are quite a few other Rails applications out in the wild using this apartments gym. And so we had run into, Notch8 had run into 2 or 3 other applications using this functionality before kind of getting into the Samvera community. And so this is a widely used thing out in the broader Rails world. And you can create non-tenant tables for data that's available to all tenants. So a good example of this might be the list of all of the accounts. You can't keep the list of all of the accounts inside of each tenant, because then you wouldn't be able to know which tenants are available to you, right? Like if that list, you have to pick a tenant first and then figure out which tenants are available, that wouldn't work. So that has to be outside. It also is true that it'd be really useful to know on, like, say, a default homepage, what all the tenants are that you could potentially go to. So that's an example of a table that might be kept outside of the thing. So this is what the tenant kind of breakdown might look like. So here we see that in tenant 1, there's a user table. That user table has an ID, a first, a last name, and a created date. That you can see here that Rob exists in 2 different databases. I'm not really sure what the strike through is. That's just a mistake in my slides. Sorry about that. But that they don't even necessarily have to have the same ID. So Rob is user ID 1 in tenant 1, but in tenant 2, they're a completely different user ID. One thing that's important is that the tenants have the same schema structure. So we can't have tenant 1 that has 5 fields and tenant 2, which has 6 fields for the same user table. They need to have the same structure in each one, and that schema is then shared amongst the various tenants. So they all have the same structure, but that allows for access to be consistent as we move from tenant to tenant to tenant, because they're all, again, running through the exact same code. So here's an example of what one table might look like if we broke it down by tenant. It's also true on this particular set of slides, I chose to make them all have the same number of users, and that's not important, or it's just an incident of how I did the demo. So how we store those tenants in given databases can be different. We want our database access to be incredibly fast. And so it turns out that Postgres has this concept of schemas. If any of you have ever used the rather confusing PG admin tool or most other ways of visualizing Postgres databases, you'll notice that you say, oh, I want to go to the application 1 database. Okay, now I'm in there. Now I need to select a schema, and I'm going to select public because there's only public. It's the only option. And then I actually see my tables. And so it turns out that that whole schemas concept that most Postgres UIs make you look at, that doesn't make a lot of sense because it's almost always public, is incredibly useful in this specific type of case where we're doing multi-tenancy. And so Postgres uses schemas to allow multiple data sets with the same data structure. And what that means is that you can very, very quickly transition between given schemas. So you can say, okay, I want to access tenant 1, now I want to access tenant 2, now I want to access tenant 1 again, and now I want to access tenant 3. And that switching has very little cost. And so it gives you significantly better performance. The other thing is that when you make a schema update, that gets rolled out to all of the schemas for a given database. So if we add a new field, let's say we want to add updated at to our users table that we just looked at before, we make one change and it goes to all of the different schemas in one go. For MySQL and SQLite, the way that Apartments deals with various tenants is by creating separate databases, which means it is absolutely possible for someone to get them out of sync. So you could have one tenant's user table look different than another tenant's user table. And in that case, your code is going to be broken or flaky, right? Like the Rails application is not going to handle that very well. So how do we deal with Fedora, Redis, and Solr? As I'm sure a few of you have figured out by now, Fedora is not super widely used amongst the broader Rails community, or really outside of this data curation space. And so how do we cope with that? That's not built into Apartments. What do we need to do? So it turns out that Haiku has some pretty clever little bits of implementation that sort of expand the Apartments functionality to deal with multiple different Fedora instances, multiple different Redis instances, multiple different Solr instances. And the way it does that is it changed the connection URL for each tenant. So each individual tenant has a separate connection URL, which means that there's no shared data. And what's nice is because Fedora, Redis, and Solr are all spoken to over HTTP or HTTP-like interfaces, all we have to do is keep track of which tenant goes to which URL, and all of our crosstalk goes away. What that does mean is that, and this might be very useful for the broader Samvera community, even if multi-tenant has no use to you, is that you can use that to shard your Fedora instances. So if you, let's say, have 3 really large collections, you could have collection 1 being in one Fedora instance and collection 2 being a completely separate collection or Fedora instance, and split your Fedora instances based on that. The other possibility is if you were using Fedora's mirroring capabilities, you could use this sort of this code base to extract out and produce a tool that would allow you to switch which of the different mirrors you're hitting based on different requests, or split the requests amongst a pool of Fedora instances. So there's some really interesting potential there for high availability Fedora based on this sort of URL switching code. So what are some of the challenges of multi-tenancy? Why isn't every application out there architected as multi-tenant to begin with? Why didn't multi-tenancy get implemented in Hyrax itself? The answer is that it does bring some new challenges, and that fundamentally multi-tenancy isn't something that everybody needs, right? Like there are specific cases where it can be very useful, but there are certainly a lot of Hyrax installs out there that has no need or desire for multi-tenancy. So one of the big challenges is picking which things to isolate and which things to share. So a great example of this is that Notch8 has done some work that we're working on getting contributed back to elevate the users out of being per tenant and make a global table of all of the users while keeping all the permissions and roles information in each tenant. And what that allows you to do is log in with a single account over multiple different tenants and not have to constantly log in and out for each one and not have to manage multiple passwords, so that user management can happen at that global scale. And then the permissions, whether you can access the admin interface for a given tenant or whether you can contribute to a given tenant, would still be managed on a per tenant basis. So that also enables us to have sort of a global user dashboard, which is a really useful thing for administrating a large distributed system. So figuring out which things go in the individual tenant boxes and which things we share amongst multiple tenants is a tricky thing. And then the other thing that's always problematic when going with any kind of multi-tenant or white labeled system is testing all the combinations. So if we, a great example of this, I worked on a site for Getty Images many years ago, and they would allow you to purchase with any one of 9 currencies in any one of 16 languages. So you could be a German-speaking yen spender or a euro spending Japanese speaker. And that made that the number of possible test permutations we had to deal with just goes up substantially. So multi-tenancy means having multiple different user interfaces, having multiple different types of works that we're trying to store. And so it just means the number of testing that like reliably, especially for like final smoke testing before launching up new features, can definitely be a little trickier. And then figuring out which things to make configuration and which things to make shared code. So, maybe you have one tenant that says, hey, we really need our search bar to be on the left side instead of the right side. Like, do you make that a configuration flag or do you move it for everybody? Like, how do you deal with those things? And how do you get to the point where configuring a new tenant doesn't become prohibitive, right? How do you do that in a way that's where those configuration changes are sort of more progressive and not sort of required for initial startup. As you saw, like we're sending out data in lots of different places and storing things in many locations. So making sure we have good thorough backups is another thing that can be challenging in multi-tenancy. Again, Postgres is the winner here because if you're using schemas and you download the database dump for a table, you get all of the different schemas. So that's a huge win. It does mean that for like individual, like if you were sharing those out to clients, that you could have potential problems because you would then be, getting everyone's data, and that's not okay. How to administer the various tenants. So again, I mentioned that user work, and part of the problem that that's trying to solve is that being the super administrator in Haiku at the moment can be a little tricky as you have to like have accounts everywhere, and that's problematic. And then one sort of double-edged sword is that any upgrades are rolled out automatically to all tenants. And so that's a win in that, we push up the new version of the app and we restart it and everybody has the new code. That's awesome. But if that feature specifically is like a problem for certain people, or maybe there's a bug that gets introduced, you've introduced it to everyone. So you're going to get 15 different tickets saying, hey, this thing doesn't work. All of a sudden, instead of one ticket saying, hey, this thing doesn't work all of a sudden. By sharding out the different tenants, you can fix that problem, but fundamentally, one code base has a lot of wins, but also those potential problems. Those are that's the end of my prepared slides. I'm more than happy to do any questions. I've been keeping an eye in the Slack channel if anybody has questions they'd like to post there. Again, I'm Rob Kaufman, and I was glad to talk to you guys about Haiku. I'm really excited about the development effort that's been happening in Haiku lately. So lots of good things happening there in the future. Did anybody have any questions?
I'm taking a look here to see if anything's popping up in our document. And nothing has popped up. You were that crystal clear, Rob.
Everyone's still at lunch.
We have 90 people online. Well, if there's no questions, I'm going to move on, but I do want to give it another few seconds. But great presentation.
Thanks. Looks like Aaron is typing in the channel right this second, but I'm always happy to give people 10 minutes back. Cool. Looks good.
All right. Well, next up, we have the round robin reports, and these are going to be really rapid fire. We're going to be hearing from, I think, like 7 different groups here very quickly in about 3 minutes. And we'll do questions again and then wrap it up for the day. I want to thank everybody so much for participating and the great presentations. So with that, Julie H. is back on, and some other folks we've heard from before. So Julie, you ready to go?
I am ready. Are you hearing me?
Yep.
All right. Hi, I'm Julie Hardesty, the metadata analyst at Indiana University, and along with Ruth Tillman, the cataloging systems and linked data strategist at Penn State University, we co-facilitate the Samvera metadata interest group. This interest group works together on base metadata recommendations for the Samvera community. We meet on the 4th Tuesday of the month from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. We're on Samvera Slack in the metadata channel, and we have a Samvera-metadata Google group as well. Activities for this group since Samvera Connect in October include recording demonstrations from super awesome community members. Jen Young at Northwestern University shared a Hyrax implementation called Donut using the questioning authority gem for linked data URI lookups. We also had a demonstration of different machine-readable metadata modeling tools from Chrissy Rissmeyer at UC Santa Barbara, Arwen Hutt at UC San Diego, and Christina Harlow from, at that time, Stanford University. Other activities included filing issues for metadata changes needed in Hyrax based on the metadata application profile that we created prior to Samvera Connect last year. We also explored creating a Fedora 5 user guide for metadata folks and collection managers to provide examples of ways to model objects in Fedora and details about how metadata is managed and which namespaces are provided upon install. Beyond that, we discussed various topics that you will be hearing about from some of the upcoming working group updates, including machine-readable metadata modeling, the Samvera Community Vocabulary Manager, the mods to RDF mapping recommendations, and geopredicates work. I'm ready for the next slide. Upcoming activities include this summer scheduling a demo of NewRax, which is itself a demo install of the latest stable Hyrax release. Making updates to the Hyrax metadata application profile in the Samvera community knowledge base based on some of those filed issues that have been addressed, and providing help with documentation for work types in Hyrax and other related metadata issues. Our next meeting is Tuesday, May 28th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern, and if you are interested, please join us. Thank you very much, and thank you, Ryan, for putting the slides forward.
Next up is Ryan Wick from Oregon State.
Hi, this is another Ryan. I'm a web developer at Oregon State University Libraries. So for the Samvera URI selection working group, we do not currently have regular meetings. We've mostly been on hiatus kind of while the work basically to get the vocabulary manager infrastructure up and running. Since this group is kind of evaluating predicate submissions, we kind of need a place to put them. So that's kind of why this group hasn't had active meetings. But we do have a GitHub where submissions can be made. And we have had one predicate submission from the community since last Connect, I believe was a time frame. And go ahead for next slide. And I'll just say, so far we've had, you can see it in the GitHub, but we've had 3 distinct submissions from the community so far, and some other possible ones coming from some of the other working groups. But those have not been finalized yet. So current upcoming activities is continue to work on the vocab manager infrastructure. I was hoping to have a bit more to present on that today, but that's still kind of a slow process. So the group is still open to community submissions and can review those as they come in. Basically help determine if a submission for predicate is unique and needs to be proposed by us, or is there's an existing predicate out there that fits. So yeah, and then continue to work with other working groups and explore and document the Samvera system predicates. There's a handful in there that are kind of just used and not documented anywhere. So having a place that those can be presented and documented. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Next up, we have Evan back with Mods to RDF Working Group.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so this was a subgroup of the Samvera metadata interest group that was started to develop a mods to RDF mapping. So to be able, basically, the goal was to how do we support mods level description in Fedora 4, and the move from data streams to RDF modeling of metadata. And so this group has been working for quite a long time, but we're basically finished at this point. The group's work is essentially complete. We released the 1.0 version of our mapping recommendations. If you want to, they're linked here. If you want to know more about the process, we did a presentation at the Samvera Connect at Utah that the slides are available for. But basically, since the last Connect, we've just we put out a recommendation draft for feedback. We got a bunch of feedback. We integrated that into the draft released version 1.0, and then kind of announced that to a bunch of various lists. So as I mentioned, the work is more or less finished. We are planning to have like a quarterly standing meeting on the books that would allow us to address any feedback that we receive on the recommendations. There are some predicates that we were unable to map successfully, and so those have some placeholders in the document. And so if those become available, when those become available, we will kind of add those in as time goes on. And then, as vocabularies are updated and go through version changes, we may revisit the recommendations to make sure that the spec is up to date with any latest versions of the vocabularies that are being used in the recommendations. That's basically it.
Great, thanks, Evan. Next up is Machine Readable Metadata Modeling Specification M3 Working Group with Arwen.
Hi, thanks. So this group was originally, the proposal for the group was originally drafted and sent out to the community in November of last year. And then we, after the call for participation and everything, we managed to kick off in early February. And we have, in that time, gone through most of the process of creating an initial agreed upon list of metadata properties. So the things to describe a metadata property, trying to target agreeing on terminology, defining these, looking at requirements. And there we have most of what we think will be included in the first specification version identified. We've also done some investigation in talking about the different possible serializations. And right now we're looking at using the YAML specification. Let's see. So we have some work, there's an M3 branch on the Houndstooth repository where a lot of the working versions of documents are. And could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we're working right now on kicking the tires, testing out what we have so far with sample data models, which will help us improve the syntax and refine the specification and lock down the rules. And then from there, I think that'll be the majority of the deliverables just needing to be wrapped up in a bow, and we'll also be identifying opportunities for future work. Thanks.
Thanks, Arwen. Next up, we have James from Princeton on Samvera Geospatial Predicates Working Group.
Hello, everyone. I'm James Griffin. I'm a member of the Geospatial Predicates Working Group. So this group primarily focuses upon determining and defining best practices for publishing geospatial metadata as linked data for resources within Samvera repositories. Our chair is John Hook of the University of Alberta Libraries. Unfortunately, he couldn't attend Samvera Virtual Connect this year due to a scheduling conflict. We meet monthly on the third Monday, 12 Pacific, 3 Eastern, for approximately an hour, usually less. And we have a fairly active Slack channel at GeoPredicates. Since last Connect, we have worked within the group in order to identify use cases and define specific spatial resource types that might have geospatial metadata encoded for these resources. We have been actively conducting an environmental scan of linked spatial data initiatives, which basically explores how linked spatial data is being used out in production by various organizations. And we have been actively developing documentation, mostly internal at this point, and that's been maintained on Google Drive. Next slide, please. As for the objectives of the group at the moment, we're going to be working to finish and collate the working documents that we've been actively developing. We have been working to design respec documentation. I have on the slides linked to a GitHub repository with an early draft of this. And at some point in the near future, we hope to synchronize with the geospatial interest group during their next meeting. So our next meeting is scheduled for May 27th. Unfortunately, I believe that might be Memorial Day, so we might be looking to reschedule that. But please, we invite anyone interested to freely contact us over Slack.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Next up is Evan talking about the newspaper's interest group update.
Yes, hello. Sorry, this will be the last time that you all have to hear from me today, I hope. So yeah, the newspaper's interest group, we have been working on mostly reviewing the progress of the Newspaper Works project that I discussed earlier. So if you weren't around for that, it's basically a gem that provides newspaper content models and functionality for HIRAX applications. So as that grant-funded project has progressed, we have used the newspaper's interest group as a way to kind of help us get feedback on the development progress, some design decisions that we've made, and then sort of looking at how different UX behavior works in existing newspaper content systems, and kind of debating, comparing, contrasting the best ways to represent that functionality in our project. And so that has gone from front end stuff to back end, batch end, just workflow, administrative functionality, all that kind of stuff. We've also been continuing to gather content examples of basically newspaper digitization formats and export formats from different systems and projects. Next slide, please. So again, our upcoming activities will be to continue discussing the Newspaper Works development, to do some testing on the Newspaper Works project as new features become available, and then basically continuing to advise on different UX topics, as well as administration use cases and things like that. So our next meeting is next week, next Thursday, and we hope to see you. Thanks. Thanks.
Thanks, Evan. And I think our final presenter for today is Nabila from University of Michigan, talking about the Repo Managers Interest Group.
Hi, thanks, Ryan. This is Nabila Jaffer from University of Michigan, and I co-chair Repo Managers Interest Group with Moira from Duke University. We meet every first Mondays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and the Slack group is Repo Managers. Repo-managers. So the Repo Managers group is inclusive of all different kinds of managers. There used to be a group, IT managers group, and then there was a service manager group. Then both the groups combined into this Repo Managers group. So if you are either an IT manager, project manager, program manager, service manager, repo manager, any kind of managers, you are welcome to come and attend. What we are working on so far, actually we worked on the Samvera implementations wiki page. You might have seen emails from me talking about, we created 2 different pages on Samvera wiki, one page for the in development and the other one for in production instances. So we'll be, working on those and looking at like what are the implementations in development and which ones are in production. And also it's a good list for everybody to see who's using what versions of Fedora or what gems in production or in development. So Julie Rudder was the co-chair before Moira joined in. And Julie worked around the repository discoverability subgroup. She started that group, and there is some documentation on the wiki page. Usually our topics are like embargoes, ORCID, Tombstone, file upload issues. So it really depends. If an institution is having issues with any of the features, then they usually start talking about that on the Slack channel, and that's how we add it to the agenda, and we talk about those. So the Repo Manager group also works with different other groups like Roadmap Council, Marketing Working Group, CIGAR, product owners of Hyrex also. Next slide, please. Yeah. Right, I almost covered most of these things. You can look at the website, the wiki page. It has all the notes, and also there were some demos of ORCID and Dog Biscuit. So those are all recorded, and they are available on the wiki. So usually we create the agenda based on what people want to present, and we ask the members to demo their projects or just part of the project they are currently working on, which they think could be of interest to others. There were several user interface tickets that Sarah and Steve from Oregon are working on. So they brought that to Repo Managers group to see like how can we work with them to define that work and help them with that work. And our next meeting is on May 6th at 1 p.m. So hope you can join us. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Nabila. That's about it for day 1. We made it through. Fantastic presentations all day long. We've got another 3.5 hours of this going tomorrow. If you presented today, please make sure you get your slides to the committee. Day 2 presenters, we're going to be here 30 minutes ahead of time tomorrow. So that's 10:30 a.m. Eastern time. So do be here for a tech check if you can. Everybody else, we'll see you at 11 a.m. Eastern. We'll go until about this same time. We went pretty fast today, so we'll see what happens tomorrow. But do send your questions and comments to the Slack there at Virtual Connect 2019. And I think that is it. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a great day, and we'll do it again tomorrow.